For the final presentation, I chose to focus on Leonora Carrington. I chose to focus on Carrington because the Surrealist art movement has always been something that's very interesting to me, as it prompts me to think past what I am seeing to interpret the deeper meaning behind the paintings. Surrealist artist Leonora Carrington was born on April 6, 1917, in Clayton Green, England, in the United Kingdom. Throughout her life, she moved to several different countries until she settled in Mexico City, Mexico, where she died on May 25, 2001. As a child, she had several rebellious tendencies and as such was expelled from several schools because of this nature. She was educated at several different schools because of this, which were included Penrose's Academy in Florence, Chelsea School of Art in London, and Emma D. Ozenfant Academy in London, England. However, during her time in school, she was under extremely strict control of her father, whose wishes for her did not necessarily line up with what she wanted for herself, as he wanted her to become a debutante and marry into a wealthy family. That is a portrait of her on the left, a picture of her, and on the right is her self-portrait and one of her first paintings. This painting can be considered one of the first outward artistic expressions of her refusal to conform to her father's wishes for her. She's pictured in androgynous riding clothing and surrounded by wild animals, including a hyena and a white horse. The hyena eventually turned into a common motif through her work in both her writing and her paintings, as it represented the restless and rebellious nature she had as a child. The white horse would also be a recurring motif in her work, as she used the white horse to symbolize herself in her paintings and the free spirit and separation she wished to have from her father. Crookie Hall is where she grew up as a child, which is imaged here. Carrington was one of 4 children growing up at her parents' estate, where she spent her childhood surrounded by animals and listening to her nanny's tales about Irish folklore. As she spent her childhood surrounded by these animals and stories, they eventually became extreme influences in both her writing and her painting. And through this image, you can see how miserable she thought her life was before, as it's surrounded by dark colors and mystical and often terrifying figures. Several events in Carrington's lifetime influenced her work, the first major event being her move from England to France with artist Max Ernst. This image is her work titled Portrait of Max Ernst, and again, the white horse appears. As mentioned before, the white horse was used to symbolize herself, and she created this painting to represent the freedom she felt from her family after escaping to France with her lover, Max Ernst. He was her first husband and was a German surrealist artist and is actually considered by many to be one of the pioneers of the surrealist movement. The pair quickly bonded, and he turned into not only her lover, but her mentor and her teacher. And the pair continued to support each other's artistic vision and even decorated their home with pieces of artwork that the two collaborated on. So her move was a very freeing opportunity for her, as she was able to escape how confined she felt in her previous life by her family. And this eventually opened up her mind to the surrealist nature, as while she was living in France, she was exposed to several other surrealist painters and surrealist artists. However, shortly after her move, to France, Carrington completed the Meal of Lord Candlestick in 1938, which represented the complete rejection of her Catholic upbringing and dismissal of her father's control. The painting is pictured here. The painting represents a fantastical and barbaric twist on a traditional meal that would have at one point been held at her parents' estate in the United Kingdom. The table that is depicted in the painting itself was actually the exact table that was in the dining hall of her parents' estate. Further tying the painting to her family life is the fact that the name of the title of the painting, Lord Candlestick, was the nickname Carrington often used to refer to her own father. However, she took a severe spin on the actions that she used to partake in at her family estate, as the barbaric action captured in the painting is of the female figures consuming the male infant, which was meant to be interpreted as her dismissal of control from her father and the feminine freedom she was feeling in France after separation from her family. Another major event in her lifetime that influenced her art was the invasion of the Nazis in France during World War II, which was the catalyst to her mental breakdown. Her husband, Max Ernst, had been arrested twice for being a German citizen living in France, and Carrington and friends were forced to flee from France into Spain. Once arriving in Spain, she began to feel trapped, seeing the world around her as an illusion and a hallucination, blurring the lines between reality and dreamscapes. Because of this and the fact that her thoughts were not common at the time, this led to her involuntary confinement in a Spanish insane asylum for several months. While trapped in the asylum, Carrington was subject to horrific treatment, treated regularly with caradazole, which was a drug that preceded electroshock therapy and induced terrible seizures. The treatment she endured while in the asylum and the beliefs that resulted in her being trapped there turned into heavy influences over most of her works. And her experiences and terrors in the mental asylum are demonstrated in this work, the drawing of portrait of Dr. Morales, who was the doctor that treated her while she was in the asylum. That she demonstrates the terror she was experiencing with extremely dark line and almost demonic looking eyes of the figure drawn, who, as I mentioned, was supposed to represent the doctor treating her. The same terrifying elements present in this portrait would continue throughout her work, which includes, but is not limited to, dreamlike scapes made to unsettle the viewer and the use of fearsome hybrid beasts. A third event that had a heavy influence on Carrington's artwork was the birth of her two children with Hungarian photographer Americo Eiswes in 1946 and 1947. So the birth of her children resulted in the restructuring of the subjectivity and imagery in her works greatly. Beforehand, she shied away from stereotyping female figures, and while she still did this, she, however, started to transform her work into topics more centered around domesticity and motherhood, which can be demonstrated in this painting here, The Giantess. The painting itself is of an enormously large female figure protecting an egg in her hands, and as an egg is the universal sign of life, this painting can be interpreted as a mother protecting her own children, especially considering the fact that the geese and other animals surrounding her are hunting. The influence of the Surrealist art movement on Carrington's paintings cannot be understated, as she was captivated with Surrealism at a young age and became one of the most significant female Surrealists. So the foundations of the Surrealist movement lie in the channeling of the unconscious spirit in order to unlock the imaginative powers of the mind. And the Surrealists held the belief that the rational mind actually limited the powers of the subconscious and that the subconscious should be treated equally with the conscious mind. And with this limiting of the subconscious, it weighs down the power of someone's imagination. And so one of the more common themes in Surrealism is the blurring of the line between reality and dreams. And as such, Surrealists held disdain for rationalism and realism. And rather than taking these influences of rationalism and realism, they were actually strongly influenced by psychoanalysis instead, especially the work of Sigmund Freud, especially his work centered around dreams and reality. And these elements of Surrealism can be viewed in these two works of Lenora Carrington, Operation Wednesday on the left and The Juggler on the right. I apologize, the images are kind of hard to see. And it's obvious in the fact that the figures depicted are very far from realistic in nature, as they are distorted and have unhuman-like qualities, but more subtly in the fact that it almost appears as if they could belong in everyday life. Another significant element of the Surrealist movement that had an influence on Carrington's work was fascination with women. So the femme enfant motif was a prominent element in Surrealist art, which was the culmination of the Surrealist fascination with women, and was considered to be the combination of beautiful women, mad women, and young women into one figure. And as such, the femme enfant was thought to be the conduit to a realm of fantasy and indulgence. And because of this, in Surrealist art, women were often used as symbols of volatility and uncertainty, and in general, not depicted in a positive manner. And they were stereotyped into being figures of madness and craze. So rather than subjecting her own self to these visions of women, Carrington took influence from these representations and made them their own, refusing to depict them the same way and instead redefining female symbolism. She chose to use what was typically the volatility of women in a negative manner and suggested, as a quote, that changeableness itself was actually a source of power for the female. And this can be viewed in this image, The Lovers from 1987, where all figures are androgynous in nature and there's a complete absence of any form of female sexualization. The dreamlike essences of surrealist art are ever present in her paintings, especially pertaining to the use of the artist's own experiences in surrealist art, as she added influences from her own life, including themes of metamorphosis, magic, transformation, and identity, which were very centered around who she was. As I mentioned previously, she was moving constantly around the globe and was constantly experiencing change. Dreamlike elements are ever present in this image around Wall Street or Portrait of Pablo in New York, with the mixture of human figures in the front, with hybrids and the bizarre pop of color in the background. Carrington's art is oftentimes highly ambiguous and is often extremely taken over by hybrid figures, half human, half animal, which is definitely seen in this portrait of late Miss Patridge, which was finished in 1947. And incorporating Carrington's own beliefs into her paintings, one element of her compositions was her blend of influences from her past, which was Celtic literature from her nanny, Renaissance painting, Central American folk art after her move to Mexico, medieval alchemy, and Jungian psychology, as Jung was closely related with Sigmund Freud. And one of Carrington's most used techniques in her artwork was the illusion she used to make the pieces she created aesthetically beautiful, but containing deeper meanings that would be unsettling for some viewers. I find Carrington's artwork to be incredibly captivating, which inspired me to think deeper into the paintings to find meaning that I would have once overlooked. Surrealism, as I mentioned, has always been an art movement I found deeply interesting. However, rather than being turned away by the unsettling nature of surrealist artwork, I'm attracted to the messages that are being conveyed. And one of the more important things I learned while studying her work was that we have so much to learn about the unconscious mind, and surrealism is exactly what is the element that could teach us. Her artwork teaches the viewer to think about things in a certain way and think about why we think certain ways. And I believe this has incredible potential to alter the worldview of people as she successfully blurs the bounds of reality and what we perceive as truth. And today, almost a century after the Surrealist movement, Carrington remains one of the most relevant artists of the movement's peak, as she left behind the legacy of redefining what it means to be female in a Surrealist painting, choosing to represent women as strong figures with the power of knowledge and power of incredible intelligence who can outwit and outpace male counterparts, which was seldom represented in Surrealist artwork. And as such, before her death in 2011, Carrington was considered to be one of the greatest female painters of the Surrealist movement, and when she died, she was believed to be the last of the Surrealists.